Greetings, friends. You're listening to the As Temperatures Rise podcast, where we dialogue about what it means to be human in these complex and troubled times. Hello, Sophie.
Hi.
Really good to be with you. Thank you for taking the time to be on the podcast. I've been very much looking forward to having you on here. Remembering that we met in February of this year, 2020, when I flew over to the UK to attend your 6-day deep dive grief tending training. And as a part of my story, I came back after that training 2 weeks later, went into the Death Valley desert lands for a 2-week vision quest. Coming out of that, the world was going into lockdown.
Wow.
And then 2020 has continued to deliver on unprecedented uprisings and inflammations. So it seems that training in grief tending in February was just in time. I'd love to start with some of your background. I remember you sharing kind of your crooked career path, which felt very familiar. Also, I've had quite an awkward, non-linear career path. And I think for many of us in this time of systems collapse, there's a sense of that crooked pathway now making sense. Like all being training for this time of complexity and breakdown. So yeah, a little bit about your background that brought you into this field of grief tending.
Thank you. Yeah. Well, I want to say, it's exciting to be here. Grateful for what you're doing, and what a journey that must have been, isn't it? Grief tending, Death Valley, and then lockdown. What a year. It's probably easiest to kind of go backwards. I feel I've ended up in grief tending at the end of a journey, and you could say a kind of orienting question all the way through has been, why do humans create a world and a society and systems with so much suffering and not do anything about it? Or many people are doing a lot about it, but collectively, or those in power, or the whole modern Western civilization project isn't responding to all of the signals of pain and suffering amongst the people in the modern Western world, but also in other parts of the world and the rest of the living system, the rest of life on the planet. And I suppose at the starting point for that, as it is for many people, was why do my parents create a family system where there's suffering when they're good people? And then I guess, So that sort of question, does anybody really want this? Is this really what somebody or some people want? And the sort of pieces on my journey, once upon a time I was an engineer. I was interested in technology with that very Western belief that technology has got answers. I didn't last long as an engineer in British industry. And fairly soon I was encountering the kind of sexism that was really waking me up to stuff about gender. And that part of the system of violence and oppression. And then I came out in my 20s. I was in a world of a lot of lesbians, working class lesbians, black lesbians, playing football in quite a radical way, challenging all the oppression, football team. So I got really woken up to other dimensions of our system and how it creates power inequality and inequality, and really an inequality in suffering. But also, that sense, it's starting to see that the whole system is pervaded by suffering, isn't it? That those on the upside of privilege aren't happy either. They're also trapped, but they get a big compensation. Those on the downside get the suffering without the comfort, or the sort of compensations that our system gives to those with money or wealth. And then I started an inner journey. I started on my own therapy. I guess a journey that I see again that many people do is to start out, especially if you have privilege in this system, kind of believing it's self-story. And then as it fails to deliver or fails to kind of support your healthy growth, gradually becoming disillusioned. So I had what I would call breakdowns, but also, failing relationships. So the sense of things not making sense took me into my own inner journey. And I ended up training as a therapist, and getting very interested, not just in personal individual therapy, but in systemic understanding. So family constellations, I came across ecopsychology, Joanna Macy's work, the small questions about suffering, the big questions about suffering. And then I came to Devon. I left London, came to Devon in 2006, just as the transition movement was birthing, and got involved in the kind of the first wave of that here in Totnes in Devon, where I live now. And then took my sort of strange range of skills into creating a training for that with my then partner, Naresh. And we took the training around the world. So yeah, I became a kind of very much in that, both a shaper and a creator, but also a carrier of something that transition was offering, with its limitations. There were good things about that movement and its own splits. And I guess part of my interest within that was always, how can we look at our own shadow? How can we be exploring where what we're doing isn't aligned with our values? I got particularly interested in burnout, seeing how endemic burnout is in many organizations for change. We're trying to stop the planet burning out, but often we create a culture of burnout where we burn ourselves out. How does that work? And that took me into getting very interested in stress systems, in trauma, in unconscious, and this sort of question, what is it that organizes healthy human culture to be life-sustaining, sustainable, vibrant, to some extent joyful and peaceful? What is it that creates human cultures which are rooted in denial and the sort of hiding and avoidance of suffering that then perpetuates more suffering? And out of that, as an engineer, I sometimes say, for me, pain and suffering is in some ways the most important feedback loop in a human society. If we're ignoring the place where suffering happens, we don't know where things are going wrong. It's like we can't actually see into the culture that we've created. So grief tending and this form of not just taking our grief to our friends or to a private psychotherapist if we're lucky enough to afford that or have that available, but how do we start to recreate a kind of circle where we hold each other in our grief, and grief stops being something we avoid but becomes a medicine, and a medicine for the community, both in how it reconnects us in the moment, but also in how our grief starts to give us an insight into what's wrong in our lives and our world. So that's quite a long answer to your question.
I appreciate this central driving question, that has been there for you throughout your life, and it feels, again, really resonant. I remember being a young kid and looking through National Geographics of the Vietnam War and just staring at some of the photos in horror and vexed, perplexed around how can humans do this to one another? Never mind what we do to the planet. And so likewise, it's been a central question for me. Is this just the way things are? Is this just how we are? Is this fundamental human nature? Or is there more to the story? And this was, of course, before understanding psychological dynamics and trauma and layers of complexity, both systemic, interpersonal, intrapersonal, cultural. So in the training, you had shared with us a map that you had put together around human culture. And I found it very useful, quite comprehensive, and a reminder that it's that it's a map, it's not the territory. But I find that these maps are useful. It connected a lot of dots for me. And I'd love to give an overview of the map. And as I'm recalling it, it started with these archetypes of being and doing, or of action and rest, and looking at the cycle of trauma, very much born out of this question at that time that you were carrying around the burnout you were seeing, that you were just speaking to in the transition movement. So yeah, wherever you want to start with that.
Okay, great. Yeah, I was interested. I was interested within transition that the conflict, or one of the conflicts, but probably the main conflict that I saw that kept appearing was a kind of split, and sometimes it might be framed as inner transition versus outer transition. Are we here to look inside? Are we here to get on with doing stuff? Is transition about food, energy, and housing? Is it about psychology, consciousness, relationship, group dynamics? And this split at the beginning in 2006 was really marked, and I thought it was interesting. In Transition Town Totnes, in a way, the project started with two very dynamic men setting up food, energy, and housing, and two women who were both psychotherapists saying, we're going to set up a psychology of change group. So in a way, Transition Town Totnes started with an attempt to integrate those two kinds of energies. In some places, there were projects that refused to have an inner transition group. It was like, this is too woo-woo, it's going to jeopardize our credibility with the council if we're doing inner work, and so on. And that same conflict, I felt like it happened in the Center of Transition Network. So this polarity between process, relationships, focus on well-being, how are we on the inside, and action. So I was interested in that. I was interested in that relating to burnout. And I guess I'd always wanted to find some way of putting together what the insights I'd got from psychotherapy to do with trauma and the unconscious, with systems of power and oppression, because those worlds often don't meet for very good reasons, with our relationship to the environment, with something about what it is to be a human being. And one of the aha moments for me was finding these pairs of archetypes that, of course, are only two of many sets of archetypes that we could look at, but feeling like I kept coming across different traditions that in some form said health is about these pair of archetypes being in balance. So in Chinese medicine, a Chinese medicine practitioner said, yes, it's about yin and yang being in balance. I was learning from Sobonfu, one of my teachers around grief tending. She said it's fire and water. There are other elements in the cosmology, but the health is when fire and water are in balance. In the psychosynthesis training, it was love and will. So are they related? And as an engineer, I'm interested, is there something underneath this? And then I started reading more about stress and trauma and nervous systems and saw, isn't that interesting that actually we have two organizing systems of perception and activation within us, the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. So is it possible that underneath these pairs of archetypes are these two inner states of internal organization of human beings, one of which is immobilizing outward, action, we're revving the body up to go and do things, the sympathetic nervous system, and the other one is slowing down, digesting, resting, but also connecting, taking us towards more intimacy, kind of a system, the parasympathetic. So for me, that was a bit of an aha moment. So then I started playing with this map and saying, what if a healthy culture is a culture that supports the healthy, relaxed flow between action and rest, and between outward movement and inward movement, between, in an organization, task and relationship. And I saw things like medicine wheels in, I don't know so much about them, but it felt like they were pointing to this cycles in nature, but also cycles of human activity and human relaxation. And it felt like it made sense to me that that would work as a ground state for human beings, is that our rituals, our routines, our practices are supporting us to move through daily rhythms, annual rhythms, seasonal rhythms of action and rest to help our nervous systems do what they need to do. So then you get to the question, well, what happens when there's stress in the system? And I was more recently reading Stephen Porges's polyvagal theory, seeing that his proposal that there's a kind of hierarchy of stress responses, the first of which is a kind of communicate, negotiate. So this is the sort of frontal cortex, what's come for us as social animals with a big frontal brain. If we can't negotiate our way out of stress, so, we may go straight to flight or fight in that order. We'll flee first. If we can't get away, we'll fight. And if we can't do any of those things, so that's the limbic brain, the older system, the reptilian brain freezes us. So, we play dead. We just shut everything down, and there's pain relief in that. And our system goes into a kind of paralysis. All of that is in my map. That's all on the side of healthy human culture, because these are all helpful, evolved responses to deal with what life brings us. I think there are some distortions about our perception of that I've come across again and again, that I just want to name some of. One is that the sympathetic nervous system is a fight-flight system. I think it's so interesting that actually the sympathetic nervous system is just a mobilized system. When you go to get up out of your chair or wake up in the morning or go to play football, we don't have to be stressed. We don't have to be in an emergency state, but we've associated the whole purpose of that system with its emergency response, fight, flight. Isn't that interesting? I think it's so interesting that it's associated with a high stress state. I've lost the other one. There's another one, but maybe it'll come back to me. And another one is that we think that our nervous systems and our stress responses have evolved primarily to deal with kind of the predator in the jungle, the tiger that comes out of the woods. But actually, I think it's interesting to look at research that says for primates, probably for us as well, most stress isn't from an external threat, it's from social interactions. 95% of the stress, I think that's the right figure, somewhere around 95% of stress responses for tribes of baboons are to do with their peer-to-peer interactions. Is my place in the troop, is it secure? Am I obeying the rules enough? Am I getting punished for being out of line? Do I still belong?
So power dynamics and conflict, belonging, the need to belong.
Yeah, exactly. So a huge amount, I would say, of our stress system is geared up to negotiate our way out of stress, and to communicate our way out of stress. Anyway, all of this, so we have a kind of ground state where we have a relaxed balance and flow between action and rest and task and relationship. We go into these, different stress states depending on the level of threat. And what's absolutely crucial to stay in a state of well-being individually and as a culture is what I call the return pathway. So when we've got to fight, flight, and especially if we've got all the way to freeze, how do we come out of that? And I feel like in the West, we're probably catching up with a lot of cultures around the world who found that they needed embodied practices to shake out and discharge the frozen stress when people had been in very acutely stressful situations. So, one story that I heard from Rob Hopkins, he interviewed one of the grandmothers at Standing Rock. I can't remember her name, and I'm sorry about that, but what do you do, or how do you support people that are coming back off the front line, that have been in the violence and the tear gas? And part of her answer was, we take them to the sweat lodge. So it's like, oh, okay, so maybe that's a kind of technology or a practice that helps us when we've been in that kind of violence and we've got some sort of freeze. A sweat lodge helps us move that through. And when I heard Sobonfu speaking about the grief ritual, so, we have the warmth of the village, dance, song, drumming, movement, a place to go and pour out your grief with support, with someone's hand on your back if you need it, a welcome back, gratitude for what you've expressed. Maybe that's a technology where whatever's frozen, whatever's kind of stuck in us, at the end of the week or the month, that's how we shake it out of our bodies. So it doesn't keep on freezing us. So if that return pathway is working, we come back to this relaxed flow. So the key thing is, if that doesn't work, if there isn't a return pathway, what happens? And I guess what I see happens is there are different ways that can occur. But if there's no return pathway, people stay with that post-stress, you could say post-trauma state in them, and they will be, in the West we're talking about post-traumatic stress, but there's all kinds of different sorts of trauma that isn't healed. But some of the symptoms are hyper-arousal, where we're overreactive, where we go into fight-flight too quickly, so we're aggressive, or we flee, we dissociate, or we simply shut down, we just numb ourselves. So there's a kind of under-responsiveness. And within all of that, we're trying to manage overwhelming experiences where this return path of holding and release fails. So there's something for me about the failure of that, where we now have two injuries. We have the first overwhelmingly frightening and disempowering experience that we couldn't negotiate our way back out of. But we have a second injury, which is that the landscape of love and support around us didn't help us to come back from it. And now we start to grow a belief about our community, our family, our culture, about life, which is there is no help for me when I need help. And that starts to become a pervading belief. If more and more people are having these experiences, or, which is what something like colonialism does, a whole people is traumatized by an invasion, by a war, perhaps also by a catastrophic climate event. So a whole people can go through a mass style, a deliberate eradication of their culture, which Britain and other European countries did in many places around the world, where people were banned from speaking, punished, or, murdered or beaten for speaking their own language, their culture, for their ceremonies and rituals. So these return pathway practices are wiped out. The healers are wiped out. The people with power maybe are killed or imprisoned, whatever. So now we have, a lot of people with trauma, a lot of people walking around. And now I feel like that the you can say the culture is organized by the psychological demands of the trauma. So now we start to have a kind of collective consciousness that feels unsafe, that doesn't believe there's holding in life, that doesn't believe there's enough resource to cope with difficulty, that doesn't want to go and feel its pain, because if it touches its pain, it'll get re-triggered into the trauma and will be unable to cope with our life's basic needs. So we avoid inner work. We focus on the outer world. We get very obsessed with power, because our fight-flight mechanism needs to know, can we beat the other person, or do we need to run away? So, once you start to describe that landscape of what's the inner world of a culture that's being organized by trauma, I think you start to see lots of resonances in the dysfunctional part of mainstream white Western systems of privilege, colonialism, modernity, capitalism, and so on, where we've lost a basic trust in life and each other and our own capacity for coping with our pain. And I think the relationship with pain is very interesting. What do we do with pain in our culture?
Numb it out.
Numb it out, soothe it.
Act it out.
Medical, we can take drugs, we'll eat ice cream, we'll go shopping, we'll get super busy. I think another one, and a way of understanding systems of oppression, is I'll put it into your body. I'm white, you're black, I'll put it into you. I'll put it into the people in Africa.
So
I'll put it into, scapegoating. I would say exporting it, isn't it? I'm going to export it to somebody with less power in the system than me.
So can I just reflect what I'm hearing, and then we'll keep going? That in the absence of this return path to the ground state, which is this fluid, organic. We're not saying that traumas aren't going to happen. Trauma is a natural aspect. I mean, there is a certain form of violence that is inherent or organic to life, which is to say there will be stress, there is stress, but it's a matter of this return pathway. And specifically in modern culture, the absence of these social technologies that would bring us back to a sense of safety and well-being and balance in our nervous system and in our relations, that effectively generation after generation after generation, that trauma has become normalized. It's the water that we're swimming in.
Yeah, I think to some extent, isn't it? And I think it's important. It's good to say this is just a map, and it's a sort of hypothesis. For me, any culture, if we have this kind of healthy side of the map of balance and flow, stress states, a return path, and the place where we're organized by trauma, where you could say those more identified with fight flight tend to run things because they've got energy. Those more identified with collapse tend not to. The fight flight people are busy putting their stress into those that are more collapsed or more powerless. Is that true? So for me, our culture has all of these things. And of course, there are many people that have been interested in trauma, that have been looking at it, trying to heal it. That's also part of the modern white Western world, isn't it? Or the, European culture. So it's not that we're only this, but I guess one way you can look at history is that there's this constant kind of dynamic between the part of the system that's being run by trauma and the part of the system, you could say, that's being run by health. And, like that quote about, what is it? The line between good and evil runs through every human heart. It's like that balance is going on inside me. I've got both. My guess would be you've got both. I think my parents had both, Yeah. So there's one last bit that I think I want to add, if that's okay, which is, I think those of us that have grown up in this kind of modern culture where there's a lot of both of these, where there is a normalization around trauma, we have these as deep frames within us. So, it may be that we're lucky, or maybe not, maybe most people have it. Somewhere in us is that experience of being held. Somewhere in us is a very basic experience of attachment that worked, where there was love, where we could cry, where we could do whatever we needed to come back into relationship. We had some of that. We had some of that was good enough. Maybe it wasn't perfect, but we know that experience and we have a taste for it. And often that drives us to be healers, or to be activists, or to be politicians that are trying to create a better world, And we have this other part of us where the holding failed, where those with power abused their power, where we got criticized and shamed instead of loved and supported. So one of the extensions of this that felt really important to me is, if you're in a movement for change, or you're attempting to change this system, if we don't go deep enough to have this analysis of these deep frames, there's a danger that we won't understand how to put messages out that actually create a genuine shift from this traumatized frame to a healthy frame. And this was a part of my experience. What I see, and I read George Lakoff's work about frames, and I saw these two systems under the things that he describes as strict father and nurturing parent. He talks about frames. I see it in Rianne Eisler's work. She talks about partnership culture and dominator culture. I saw it in Starhawk's work. She talks about good reality, bad reality. It's like other people are seeing that there are these two kind of inner states, and that they organize cultures. What I saw in the progressives, progressive movements like Transition, is that we weren't going deep enough into understanding what was underpinning the system that we were trying to change. So we were adopting some of the language of what I would say was unhealthy culture. We were talking about the new economy as if talking about the new economy was going to create enough change. It's not, because as long as you're putting the economy in the center, you're still, for me, working from a traumatized perspective, which says life is about work, it's about productivity, it's about money, it's about making things. And in a healthy culture, life is about the children. Life is about creating, holding relationships so that we have a community, a people, families, the next generation, feeling secure and held, feeling good about themselves, feeling confident, feeling a sense of responsibility to each other and to life, feeling a sense of dignity and meaningful purpose. And that is at the center. And around that, the adult world of work is in service to those children, the mothers holding the children, the fathers and the mothers holding those children. And the economy is in service to life, and those that are the most vulnerable. And we've completely turned it the other way out, isn't it? I worked as a therapist. I was working with single mothers. Their lives were in service to productivity and growth. They were the last people to be considered in terms of their needs. We've completely flipped that.
Well, you're articulating, you're speaking to one of the other questions I've been having a lot lately around, we've been at this systems change work for decades now. And why we've had little victories, we could say, but in larger scale, it's like, why has our efforts towards systems change not truly delivered in terms of foundational transformation that we know is needed? And I feel like you're speaking through your perception that our approach to systems change has been a part of the problem, right? That just talking about the new thing isn't embodying the new thing, especially in the absence of tending to the relational field, the spaces in between, the things that can't be measured and don't fit into spreadsheets.
Yeah, I think there's a I think there are some people that are doing a really great job. I once heard Molly Scott Cato, being asked some question about, I can't remember what it was about, about Europe. But she's a member of Parliament, of the European Parliament. And she was asked a question about the economy, and her answer started with, our purpose should be to create meaningful and dignified lives for everybody in the community. Like, for me, that is the frame. When you say that, it evokes that good reality frame in people, that part of us that knows what it tastes like when people are upright in their behavior, when I feel my own sense of worth and dignity, and I see that in those around me. So when you start a statement about anything political, if you start with that, it has a very different effect to, we must get the economy going again, isn't it? Yeah. So like you say, what do you put in the center, and what's the ground? Do we create jobs in order to get the economy going? Or do we create jobs because our children need certain things, and those jobs need to be meaningful in terms of supporting our children's growth and well-being, so that their lives are fulfilled, happy, creative, connected, so they feel secure in themselves, so they know how to take care of each other and the next generation and the living systems on which all of life depends,
Yeah, I'm reminded of the interview with Pat McCabe, where these are a bit my words. Are we putting, in this context, jobs at the center, or are we putting life, thriving life at the center?
Yeah. I mean, I've seen her, like put the water in the middle of the room and go, this is life. And yeah, that's it, isn't it? It's a completely different frame. And, say in the transition movement, I don't think we did that. We still were speaking about the economy as if that was our purpose, was to get a different economy going. And, it's not that that's not part of the picture, but it's not helpful to put that as your central message, I don't think.
Well, I think this also brings us back to grief and grief tending and the importance of that, because it's one thing to espouse working for change, wanting change, but the implications of that change and the fear of actually letting go of a way of being or a way of life that we've been promised, perhaps even unconsciously not consciously realizing how much that drives our behaviors and our habits. And that my sense is the need to really touch into our collective grief, not just our our personal losses, but also collectively what's happening on the planet right now. And that this thriving life is locked up. It's locked energy in that frozen state of grief.
Yeah, I think that's really good, isn't it? It's really, really, really helpful to see that. And I get very interested in the relationship between grief and burnout. So, one of the programs that I teach is a burnout retreat. And I'm fascinated that we don't have grief anywhere in the schedule. But at some point, people that are not, this is often people that are frontline healthcare workers or teachers, or some people from business, or, as well as occasionally there are activists. But, there are people that are in professions, or all kinds of different professions, exhausted or worried about being exhausted. And at some point, often when we're sharing, and as their systems relax, and as they come out of this constant driven sympathetic nervous system arousal, at some point the circle will start speaking about grief. So, and it might be that it's somebody's bereavement. I never stopped to mourn the death of my father, or my relationship broke up and I just worked even harder. And sometimes it is the vicarious grief of, I'm on the front line of trauma every day in my job, and there's never any time to process how that feels. So we have this, isn't it? We have these organizations and systems where there's people are supporting those that are suffering or experiencing their own suffering, and there isn't a normalization. It's not normal to say, I'm going to take 2 weeks off. This grief of this death, this end of the relationship, the loss of my job, it might take me a couple of months, to get back on my feet again, or it's still with me, Oh, yeah.
Or the being judged. Aren't you over that yet?
Yeah. All these things, isn't it? All of these ways, that we celebrate people for their strength. Isn't she doing marvelously? She's back at work already, instead of celebrating the people that are really taking their time to do the grief process fully and, go let it transform them. It's a big piece, isn't it? And I think it's one of the things that feels really important is is to see that different cultures and different part of the system will have a different relationship to pain. So I've been reminded, for instance, by a young Black woman in a workshop, when I speak about how our system avoids pain at all costs. She said, pain was my lived reality all the time. I wasn't avoiding it. There's no way that I could avoid it. And if you're dealing with constant racism, constant poverty, isn't it? You're in that stress state, and it just feels really good to name part of what privilege lets us do is to have that possibility of avoiding the pain, isn't it? Through comfort, through an illusion that somehow it's not in us,
and that itself is part of the pain.
Yeah.
When we really let in another perspective.
Yeah, and in that, isn't it? There's all kinds of feelings to do with privilege. The whole thing of fragility, white fragility, or male fragility, or isn't it? In a way, is about what a false construct this identity of privilege is, because underneath it are people who have very little resilience, often around dealing with pain, but especially they have very little resilience dealing with guilt and shame. So as soon as something comes along that challenges this position, and I can absolutely feel it in my own body when I get challenged around race or class or, something else where I'm on the upside. There's a kind of a feeling of something that I just don't know how to deal with it. So much easier to try to shut it down, push it away. I won't engage with that. So we could say, that there's a systemic challenge in working around privilege, that those who most need to do the work are the ones that are least resourced and equipped to do it and have the most possibility to go on avoiding it. But I found it helpful in a way, because when I learned about power and oppression in my 20s, so what is that, 30 years ago now, it felt like a lot of it was framed around power, and it's important, that analysis is really important, but it's felt helpful to think of it also as a system that's being organized by pain, by the attempts to manage unmanageable pain, or unmanageable feelings. And if I think of public school, boys in public schools, and that whole kind of lineage of educating the elite of colonial systems, where vulnerability is absolutely shamed or beaten or punished. You know, what capacity do those men, you know, and to some extent women, but, you know, what capacity do they have to deal with difficult feelings? And, you know, when have they ever learned that it's possible to be held in those? You know, and of course, there are the people that have been trying to heal that wound and that part of the system as well. And I, you know, I want to say that I have a very strong belief that we're wired to support each other. You know, I think our nervous systems have evolved to expect to be held. So when we don't get held as children or as adults, when there isn't that healing, we feel it as an outrage or as a sense of abandonment or loss. And for me, that's really, it's one of the most positive things that gives me hope, is that even if the world truly goes to shit, you know, which I think is quite likely, still there's something in us as humans, even if the epigenetics of trauma get passed down, I still think there's something in our nervous system that wires us to expect certain things and wires mothers to want to give certain things, that makes the possibility of reconnection always present in us. You know, and if we find the places where we can taste that and we can reawaken that longing, you know, when we get a taste for it, you know, and this is what I see in some of the grief tending ceremonies and circles that I've held, we get a taste for it. It's such a good taste, isn't it? Like how many people come to those and they get really passionate about, I want this in my community. And because it makes sense to every part of my being. And the loss of it, you know, when I taste the loss of it and the absence of it,
it's another grief.
Of course, it's another grief. Like,
I love how I remember, yes, in the training, you challenged Maslow's pyramid in that sense, that this need for connection isn't an actualization, isn't something that we come to after that it is a foundational need.
Yeah. And you know, for me, the kind of, you know, all these different Western explorations of the inner world, you know, for me, it feels like attachment theory is the one that seems to be getting very, very backed up by the neuroscience of what happens in early child development. But, you know, also it seems to be very helpful for understanding adult relationships. And I think that's another place where we have a very distorted view, you could say, of what it is to be human, you know. So, and you know, I don't think it's a coincidence that a lot of the people that are writing about this are white, male, academics, you know, that are writing about positive psychology or, you know, these things. They're not the ones that are holding the children at home, on the whole. They're not the ones who are, you know, at the school gates, you know, looking. They're the ones that are leading very separate, often adult lives where their sense of self is defined by their work. So they're defining human purpose and meaning in terms of work. And I think a very different sense of what it is to be human is that primarily we are our attachments. You know, what does it take to be a healthy, happy human being? That I feel securely held by those close to me and the wider sense of community, that if anything happened to me, I would get support, I would have that return path, and I would be able to offer that to others, which would give me a sense of purpose, meaning, and dignity, and to the natural world, you know, that when I look out, I see that all of that is in good shape. You know, I'm not distressed by seeing that there are people in poverty, people being abused, you know, women being raped, Black people being beaten up and killed, you know, that those with power use that power in service to the well-being of the whole. And so this feeling that kind of attachment and relationship and care is absolutely at the center of who we are as human beings and what it takes to create peace in us, you know, what it takes to create a state in me where I can both act and rest without stress, you know, because as soon as I'm witnessing, isn't it all our mirror neurons, as soon as I'm witnessing that suffering out there, it affects me in here. We're wired to be connected. So yeah, I think Maslow, saw different aspects of human reality, but to put them in a hierarchy is a traumatized view, and to put the material at the bottom is a traumatized view. Much, much better to say we need all of these things. We need our subsistence. We need our relationship. We need meaning and purpose. We need all of them equally to create healthy people and healthy cultures. Much more helpful.
I think that's so important to say and name the way you just did, that's a traumatized view, because it has become, over the last many decades, we've mistaken it as fact, as an isness. And I love your articulation around attachment being the foundation, which does feel like we're coming to realize in the new physics, with entanglement, all of which feels like we're catching up with. It's a new way of remembering old ways of ancient, which many indigenous cultures, of course, never lost. This foundational operating system of interbeing, or in the Zulu, use the term Ubuntu. There's countless traditions in which we could name this. I want to share a story. I want to get to what you're seeing in your work since COVID. But as you're speaking, I want to share a story from yesterday that feels relevant from my position of power, being white-skinned in the United States. And so the fires, right, just ripped through the Rogue Valley where I live, taking out, I think the last count was around 2,500 homes, around 40,000 people displaced, the majority of which were already disenfranchised people in the area, many of them migrant workers. Yesterday, and I'm getting some footage for a documentary that I'm helping out on around climate change and climate justice. And I went and interviewed a Hispanic family yesterday of five, a young couple with 3 children, 9 years old, 5 and 2. Met with the 5 of them. They were at the Red Cross Center doing laundry and listened to their story. They came to this country 15 years ago and all of their children born here, but they came here to provide, quote unquote, a better life for their children. And in a matter of hours, everything that they materially had been working for went up in smoke, quite literally. And I turned off the cameras. I got the pieces that I was tasked to get, and instead of just recording and leaving, I turned off the cameras because my own heart was so cracked open. As Jairo is sitting here weeping, with his 2-year-old crawling across the table, and this is one instance of many. This is probably 500 other families in his situation now, without housing, without the prospect of housing in the place that they call home, because there is no affordable housing in the area. And I'm confronted with my own sense of helplessness in this moment. What can I do in the face of this complex, I feel like systemic crises? I feel like the fires here are really revealing, yes, this tragedy of systemic crises. And the only thing I knew to do in that moment, was just to turn off the cameras and listen to their story. But I had to confront my own discomfort. I had to confront my own sense of, isn't there a super woman's cape I can put on and do something change something, fix something. And I came home, and the only thing I felt like I could do was sit down and cry. And even confront how that doesn't feel like enough. But I'm beginning to recognize, especially in this last month, the degree to which I really let that in, and seeing the complexities here and the suffering, and how easy it's been for me to not even realize that those communities are here. They've been invisibled communities. But the degree to which I really feel that pain and let it work through my biophysiology, my psychology, my spirituality, like I feel it changing me. And again, this isn't something that we can map out, or there's not an easy metric for it. Which I feel like we shoot ourselves in the foot, because we're always looking for, well, how can we measure that to know that it's a thing? So I just wanted to share that as a personal anecdote to what we've been speaking, and just confronting. It feels like this time it's a deep reckoning, and part of the medicine right now is to actually feel the pain, to confront our own complicity, not from a shame and guilt, or perhaps there is guilt there, but health. How do we keep guilt in its healthy? It's in its healthy form, which is to say something has gone wrong here, and how am I accountable? How are we accountable? Because otherwise nothing, right? We don't learn from the past. Nothing can truly change. Right, and I think we talk about, I know in the interview with Francis Weller, we talk about this archaeology of grief, that when we start to look, perhaps it's a grief over here, that the degree to which we can really hold presence to, it starts to unlock this Grand Canyon, deep layers of grief, both personal and collective, ancestral. And I imagine you've been really... This brings us into this question of, I'd love to hear what you've been seeing since COVID. I know you've been working some of your programs online, and I'd love to just hear what you're seeing, what you're witnessing that may be different in this time, where it feels like the stresses in 2020 have been immense.
Yeah, I mean, I just like to say there's a couple of things that just come, hearing your story and acknowledging that sense of how what happens, isn't it? Reveals some of what the system normally hides. And partly COVID has done that, isn't it? About how inequality affects people in their bodies differently. So in this country, Black and ethnic minority people, have higher rates of death or serious health threats from experiencing COVID, because of hypertension, because of stress that's already in their systems, is one way of understanding. That's how I've understood it. And then, all of the landscape of inequality, poverty, violence, domestic abuse, is exacerbated as another whole layer of stress comes into the system. So, if I, in that kind of sense of, there's the side where there's more health and more resource and a sense of being able to cope with things. It's like this whole thing comes and moves the system. I can feel it in my own system, and I see it in the system of lots of people around me. It's like a whole layer of my own emotional capacity is taken up with dealing with uncertainty, loss of identity, loss of income, small things compared with the migrant workers that you're speaking about, but still have an impact on me and my ability to then respond to those that are in a much worse situation than me. And the second thing that I want to say is to speak to this idea, that I'm sure you've covered elsewhere, but about that there's a meaning and a purpose and a healing that can come from going towards the grief, and there's something about being wise about how we do that and doing it from a place of resource or from a place, where we have enough connection. And, sometimes that isn't what happens, is it? Sometimes, we lose everything like that family and we're just in it and we're cast adrift in a sea of loss, and there's no choice. But that sense of, can we find any anchor? Can we find some holding? Can we find something that gives us a kind of ground from which we can go into the grief and then come back again? Even if it is one relationship, the offer of some bit of support, something, and for me, there's a kind of wisdom that, again, we've come to probably in some ways quite slowly in the West, that actually just diving in without a preparation, without a holding, can just keep the pathways of feeling overwhelmed, feeling lost, feeling powerless. It can just keep those neural pathways getting strengthened and strengthened. So Peter Levine's work about touch it where we can, touch it and come back, touch it and come back. So I want to speak that bit of wisdom that I've learned. It's not what I was being taught when I did a therapy training 20 years ago, but it feels like we've come to that more recently in the West. And again, if you look at, if I think of, the ceremony that Sobonfu shared, it's like it's built into the ceremony. Go and do a bit, come back, go and do a bit, come back. And we start from this place of singing, connection, drumming, contact, fire, warmth. And I think there are moments, when there isn't enough resource in the system and where it is too raw, and actually going towards grief and trauma isn't helpful. And sometimes the work is to not do that. And it is just to put foundations in place and to put ground in place. And it is to, which may be a bit of a contradiction to kind of the challenge to Maslow, but it's like sometimes we need to put in place the ground so that then there's enough feeling of capacity to not get lost in the grief. That there's a place to come back to and a place from which we hold that. And again, for me, that it's not just about putting the material in the center, but it's about putting the relationships in the center. May there be loving arms, may there be a warm smile, may there be somebody with stability who can pull you back and give you the comfort and the sense of not being alone in it, and not only being with other people that are lost in the overwhelm. And I guess I think that all of these are kind of insights and practices, that we can try to learn and develop and support in these times. And like you say, the edge of, not extracting more from cultures that my culture has decimated, but finding ways that we can create the spaces where we let the truth and the pain of the truth transform us, where we can let that in to an extent that there are things that we would never do again, or a sense of identity or a sense of the world that it will never look like that again, and I can't pretend that thing isn't happening. I think the thing about guilt is interesting. in one of the things I thought was super helpful from Hellinger, he's another kind of Western perspective. He said guilt is not an absolute moral compass. This was one of his big insights in the constellation where guilt guards our belongings to the groups that we depend on. So, if we depend on a group that is psychopathic, we'll be psychopathic in order to preserve our belonging to that group, and we'll do it in a clear conscience. If we belong to a traumatized culture, we'll adopt the traumatized view of that culture, because our existence depends on it. It's like we're wired to belong. And I think it's a helpful reframing of what conscience and guilt are, that we think that they go with us as an absolute moral compass. He said they don't. It depends on the group that we're part of and the moral compass of that group. But what that says, one of the things that clarified for me is, as we open to listening to the experience of others, and I feel the guilt of my privilege, that guilt comes because I'm not in a just and right relationship. So as my sense of belonging extends, the guilt is helpful to make me question, what am I doing? How do I come into right relationship with that?
It's another pain point.
Yeah.
And pain as something wise. Something coming to, it's a data point.
Yeah. I mean, there's some, I like this idea, or I found it helpful that there's some grief that even if you were in the most immaculately healthy human culture possible, we would still have loss, isn't it? We would still be shedding identity. There would still be transition. People would still die. There would be sickness. And there's a kind of innocent grief of life's processes doing its thing, including, stresses. But actually, in our culture, it's almost like because we can't see it, it's like we manufacture suffering on such a scale. The amount of suffering of children, the amount of suffering through poverty, the amount of suffering through insecurity, through exporting our pain to other countries, through, poisoning of environments and all of the health consequences of that, through stress, through financial insecurity. It's like, what an incredible job we've done of making a world of suffering with this incredible, material technologies that we haven't really solved any of those problems. The problem is not, isn't it? It's so obvious. Once you the problem is not a technical problem. The problem is a problem of relationship, and that relationship to each other and to pain feels to me really central. Really central.
Anything else that you would like to share? Any insights in the work that you've been doing? I mean, looking at time and starting to wind down, but any particular insights or practices that have felt useful in the work that you've been doing with folks since COVID?
This isn't particularly since COVID, but I think there's, this phrase that I came up with, healthy human culture. It's like, what is healthy human culture? So there's one part which is to go towards the grief and include it and create spaces where we can listen to that in a way that is healing, and that is like where grief becomes a medicine. And I think the other side is about really strengthening the things that give us resilience. And I'm sure you have other people that speak to that. But I think there's we talk about this lovely image in the grief tending work that I think comes from Martin Prechtel, this image of the two wings of the bird. He talks about grief and praise, but actually that praise part is really important. And if we don't have enough of the goodness, if we don't have enough of what holds us in life, what pulls us towards life, whether it's beauty or loving connection or playfulness or a feeling of meaning and purpose, these things that make life feel good and go, yes, I want to take another breath. I want to live another day. For that, that wing can kind of get diminished, and then we don't have enough capacity for that wing, like these two go out together. So I just want to speak for the strengthening of these practices. And one of the things that can happen is when life is stressful, we can lose the practices that give us that wing of joy, praise, connectedness. And I've loved some of the stories that I've heard of people that, where when lockdown happened, they said, I'm sending 3 texts to people every day to say something appreciative, to say thank you for this thing that was a meaningful conversation, or, I love the thing that you did. So whether it's appreciation or celebrating what we've got, or, just noticing that there is still beauty. And of course, there'll be some people that are not in a space able to do that. But for me, it feels important that we remember that as practices, to remember to keep thanking each other and appreciating, to remember to celebrate and honor and be grateful for the things that give us a taste of sweetness, or a taste of love, or a taste of something good.
That feels so crucial in this time when it's too easy to look out and go into that downward spiral of despair. Thank you, Sophy, for sharing thank you for your life's work, your devotion to this driving question of what makes a healthy human culture, and for sharing your hard-earned insights and wisdom.
Well, likewise to you, Katie. Isn't it beautiful to spend time with you, and I look forward to more of your films and documentaries that you're making.
Well, to be continued. Yeah, we'd love to get you back on.